Nadine Jacobsen, is it McLean?
McLean, yes.
McLean,
Jacobsen-McLean.
gotcha. And she is the president of the National Network for Early Language Learning and a Spanish teacher at Middlebury Interactive Languages. She has a BA in Spanish from the University of Louisville and also a Master's of Education in ESL and Second Language Acquisition, also from the University of Louisville, and is currently, I believe you're completing your Doctor of Education in Learning and Leadership at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga.
Exactly.
Okay. And she's going to speak to us tonight about differentiating instruction, how to adapt available materials when they are designed for perhaps a specific proficiency level, but are not suitable for an online class in which we often have students at a variety of proficiency levels. And this is one of the subjects that many of you mentioned you were looking for a little help on in the first session when you introduced yourself and said what you were looking for in this course. I noticed many people were looking for ideas for differentiating their instruction. And so I think we have a lot of people out there this evening who are very excited to hear what you have to tell us. So you may go ahead and get started whenever you're ready. Your screen is up. I can see it and I can see you.
Oh, great.
So please take it away.
I am Nadine Jacobsen-McLean. I'm an online instructor for Middlebury Interactive Languages. So I work with students from kindergarten through 12th grade from just a variety of backgrounds. Since I'm certified in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, my students are mostly from those states. However, I can have students in Rhode Island or in Nevada and all over. I am working on my doctorate in learning and leadership, and I am expecting, so if I sound like I'm running out of breath, I'm not in labor, I run out of breath easy. And I will be passing on the baton. This is my second year as president. We do 2 years as president-elect, president, and then past president. Unfortunately, I will not be at ACTFL this year to join the rest of the NEL members at our annual breakfast, but I do have a long history in elementary school education. I started out in Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky, and originally I'd want to be an ESL teacher, but I found it so much fun teaching Spanish that I stuck in elementary school where I had 600 students, 25 classrooms, and that's where I learned a lot about differentiating instruction. Also, one of my first experiences with learning about students with special needs and differentiating instruction for just different levels in general was with one of our professors would bring in a parent and who would specifically advocate for their child and their special needs. And I was very moved to have each of these parents come in and talk about their struggles and their challenges. And it helped me to be much more empathetic and to all the students in my classroom, and really encouraged me to want to make that learning accessible for all students. So this presentation, I'm not sure if it touches exactly like what what the summary says. So I've actually split this up into 2 parts. And there's a project that I just worked on with Middlebury Interactive Languages was to look at our materials, just the actual materials that we present online in that virtual learning community to the students, and see if it is accessible to all learners. And so the first part of this presentation, I would like to just get familiar with the equity and accessibility of our materials online, something that if we start to consider it from very early on as the virtual world adapts and we learn ways to adapt to these learners that are coming into our virtual classrooms, it's not something that we have to learn or relearn how to do. I noticed that even when I created this presentation, I was thinking, oh, I'd like to put pictures and flashy things on there. So you'll notice that even the presentation is going to reflect this idea that although I have a way that I learn, it's not going to be necessarily representative of all my learners. So you'll see a very simple backgrounds, very simple images, and so forth. But like I said, the beginning is going to be, we're going to be talking about equity and accessibility. There's a great report done by the U.S. Department of Education, and it talks about reimagining the role of technology in education. Also, we'll just touch on kind of accommodations. It is the law, so again, we want to be in compliance with the law and make sure that our virtual classrooms are accessible to all learners. And then I'll provide you with a couple of resources. Again, I'm not going to go very in detail with that part, but I just want to make sure that we start off with that because it's something that we have to integrate in our lessons as we go along. And then part two, we'll talk about differentiating instruction according to proficiency levels in our classroom. And hopefully everybody's familiar with the ACTFL proficiency levels. I just kind of put that out there. However, I won't go into much detail with that. There's also been some buzz about badges, which I'm really excited about. And different scenarios. We'll talk about scenarios and brainstorm some possible scenarios, or maybe hear about some scenarios that you all use that kind of encompass the different proficiency levels. So again, I mentioned the reimaging of the role of technology in education, and just to kind of summarize the legal aspect of it, you know, it started with the Rehab Act in 1973. In 2004, we have the IDEA Act, or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Improvement Act. 2008, the Higher Education Opportunity Act. And you can see just every few years, we're getting more and more in tuned and in touch with inclusion and how we are going to accommodate all these students with special needs. Section 508, Standard for Electronic and Information Technology, is one of the guidelines that we were using when we were creating our online materials for Middlebury. And there's a great infographic on the Center for Technology and Disability, and it shows the evolution of the federal disability legislation from 1973 to 2016. It also goes into great detail about how we can personalize learning environments, you know, address multiple pathways to learning, you know, include personal interests. You know, there's the discussion about how students, we're preparing students for jobs that don't exist yet. So we really need to draw in those personal interests because we don't know what they're going to be doing with the language in a few years or in so many years. A lot of the jobs that we're trying to prepare them for, as you've heard before, is not even created yet. And so they also talk about learning networks. You know, we talked about, and I appreciated the previous presenter and talking about how, you know, we're getting students discussing in online communities and communicating in online communities. And then providing alternative learning environments. A lot of my students are, what I'm finding, when I do reach out to the parents and discuss, you know, what challenges they're having with the online learning, is that they left the brick and mortar schools because they weren't getting what they felt was appropriate for their child. They thought that bringing them home, doing an online learning community would be a better environment, or that they would learn better. And there's just, you know, we're still in that kind of transition of moving from brick and mortar to the online community, and the parents aren't always as tech savvy as the student in supporting their learning at home. So we do have that gap in resources. So another point that the report made was the difference between equity and accessibility. And these are things that I've just learned more recently in the past couple of years since I've made that transition from brick and mortar to virtual learning communities, is that equity relates to increasing all learners' access to education opportunities that aim to remove barriers and close achievement gaps. So as I mentioned, there were students who were taken out of brick and mortar schools because they were failing, they were struggling, and they weren't, their parents felt like they were not being supported. So they took them out and put them in online communities, and they weren't always quite prepared for that either. So, but They were just trying any other alternative to try to close that gap and try to support their children. Accessibility now refers to the design of the materials, and that's something that we have a little bit more control over, and how it accommodates to the individual needs of the learner. So just to get a few ideas of what that looks like, I've kind of created this slide just to demonstrate what not to do. So you want to use serif fonts or fonts that are very clear, not in cursive, not funky and different and decorative. You want to use dark fonts on light backgrounds, preferably black and white, and avoid extremely bright colors, flashing images, and so forth. You want to use one font throughout the entire site or whatever you're presenting. And you want to avoid overuse of italics, bolds, or capital letters for your wording. Also avoiding underlining words, because this can be mistaken for a navigation link by a screen reader. So, we also want to recognize that in the future, a lot of these students are going to be using other software in order to read and follow along with our lessons. I found a great checklist, and I have a link to it, and this kind of gives you another idea of what we're looking for, using text descriptions rather than links. Again, these are kind of things that I just pointed out in the previous slide. And again, I have a link to that, and it's just, again, I just don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just give you a familiarity and an idea of incorporating this into your lessons. So, and lastly, I just want to take a moment for this short activity, and it's basically having you take either your website or a website that you are either using, maybe your school website, and just to get an idea of where we're at and where we need to be as far as being in compliance. Now, we can't expect our lessons to be perfect and completely in compliance. However, if we start moving that way, if we start moving into that direction, we'll hopefully be able to catch up with the technology, and it won't be such a shock when they say, okay, your lessons are great, but you need to change everything. So here's the link. Oops, that's not it. Let me get out of here and just put it in there.
Right, so Nadine is going to paste the link into the chat.
There you go.
You go to that website, and then at that website, you need to have the address of a different website, the one that you're evaluating, and you paste it into their little form where it says web page address, and then it will assess that site.
And I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to check out some sites. I was really shocked at even our NEL site. Yeah. And again, this isn't to say, oh, this is, this is where we need to be. It's just showing us and giving us an idea of, where we would like to be. We'd like for all of we think that digital means accessible. And I know a lot of parents, like I said, were bringing students out of the brick and mortar schools feeling like the accommodations were not being met. And then, we think that the online virtual schools are going to be better. And we really want to make sure that it's something that, that does embrace them when they do come to when they feel like the brick and mortar experience has failed them, and they come to the online community and they're finding it is still, busy websites, too much information, overwhelming the students. Again, that's something that, this is all encompassing. And when we talk about differentiating instruction, we're talking about that child as the whole child and the whole learning experience and environment. So I'll give you just another minute to explore a couple websites if you want. And again, I also have the link to this. And as a brick and mortar teacher, I also had a website that I created for students that they could access at home. And wow, I hadn't considered all these things. So, you know, if you are creating these sites, there's just a whole plethora of sites that are created out there. This one is from Wave. It says it's the web evaluation tool, but you can see that WebAIM. There's lots of websites, both from the U.S. Department of Education and technology, that are very much involved in trying to create accessibility in our websites. But again, if you're creating something, it's just something. The criteria for these sites, you can actually see it. There's another page, and I'm going to move from this page since we all have the link already. There's the Center on Technology and Disability, the Web Accessibility Initiative. There's also other ways for you to check maybe your PowerPoints and so forth, and your Office documents, and rules to consider when you're creating those documents. Here, the checklist for the ADA compliance in online courses. That's a downloadable Word document that you can use to just kind of check through some of the documents as you create them. And again, by no means, you know, are you expected to be, your presentations or your resources that you should be perfect. But again, it's just something. It's, you know, where we're moving. It's where we're moving in that virtual learning environment. It's something to consider and something to keep in mind as you're spending so much time creating all these resources. So I noticed that we're getting lots of examples of errors and things like that. So what kind of changes do you, just based on just this brief kind of overview of creating materials, what kind of changes do you think that you can make, just simple changes, when considering this information that's been presented?
Again, everyone, if you want to jump in on audio, that's okay, or you can put your comments in the chat. Nadine, are you watching the chat right now? Are you able to see it?
Yes,
Okay.
I can kind of move it to the side.
I think that alt text is a very good place for people to begin, since it's relatively easy, and that means for every image you have in the image tag in the page, you have provided a description or at least a name of what the image is. It's relatively simple to start fixing that.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, like when we were creating these, some of the materials for Middlebury, it was a very tedious, tedious undertaking to go through and make sure that all the font is the same, or that when pictures were copied and there was words in it, you know, that we rewrote those words, we took those words and those graphics out and retyped them. But yeah, there's also some resources available for Mac users as well. But again, I'm going to move on. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, these were things that that we keep in mind as we create some of these great materials, and we share them with each other through these wonderful webinars or conferences when we get together. Again, here are the other resources. Again, if you just Google accessibility checkers or anything along this line, you're going to find just so much information and free webinars and just a lot of help. And in most universities as well should have specialists that are there to help you with working with compliance with your online courses. So moving on to part 2, the differentiation with proficiency levels. Again, we are all familiar with the ACTFL proficiency standards, am I correct?
I'm surprised that everyone is not turning on their mic at once to say, yes!
Yes, of course, great. I just didn't want to spend, a whole lot of time on that. And since they've done such a great job in, in in getting the word out about it, I'm so glad. Yes, I love to see all these yeses. It's great. It's great because we're getting on the same page. When I was years ago, when I was first talking about throwing out the grades and going with proficiency levels, it was just a real challenge. And I was doing that in elementary school. I was grateful to work with Jackie Bott Van Houten, the past president for ACTFL, and she turned me on to I can statements and proficiency levels from earlier on in my career. The next kind of pedagogy or framework of thinking about differentiation and proficiency levels and students with special needs I found is this Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And I've just got a little bit of information on there, but it kind of lays a nice little backdrop or foundation for what we're going to be discussing. And then we'll get into the fun stuff, the creative part, the scenarios, we'll have a little discussion about the badges, and then providing meaningful and encouraging feedback. Again, looking at this like from a holistic point of perspective, as differentiating learning starts from the very foundation up. It's something that, you just can't add on later. It's something that needs to be there from the very beginning, even from the font that you choose, as I pointed out in the beginning. So here is just a brief definition of what the Universal Design for Learning is. Again, this is also mentioned in that report, and I have a reference to the U.S. Department of Education report that also talks about an Indiana school that has really grasped this idea of universal design for learning and are working on really incorporating it into their lessons. So basically it is the curriculum, the goals are provide an appropriate challenge for all students. Again, that word all is going to be, throughout this presentation and anything you find in differentiated instruction, all students. Materials have a flexible format. They're supporting transformation between media and multiple representations of content to support all students' learning. The methods are flexible and diverse enough to provide appropriate learning experiences, challenges, and supports for all students. And assessment is sufficiently flexible to provide accurate ongoing information that helps teachers adjust instruction and maximize learning. So the application of this would mean providing multiple means of representation, keeping accessibility in consideration again. So you're providing different ways to present the information. In elementary schools, we use a lot of manipulatives, so things that are tangible, visuals, and providing multiple means of expression. So you could be writing, creating with language, and providing multiple means of engagement, collaboration, and scaffolding. So again, this just kind of lays the backdrop of, what we're going to be discussing as far as differentiating instruction and trying to incorporate all those learners. I know we have very diverse learners in our classrooms. Your response to a prompt might be a novice low from one and then intermediate low from another. It just depends on what your virtual environment, your virtual learning and teaching environment is. Now, some of the issues that I have noticed with scenarios and prompts are some of the ones that I've got here, that I've described here. It says, your teacher asks you to write about your family. Now, I know this is a really common prompt. However, a lot of the times when we ask students very personal questions, another one is describe an illness you or a family member has had recently, they start to want to use vocabulary that they're not yet prepared for. And so in our virtual learning community, we call using outside resources. We don't like to use the word cheating. So we use academic integrity infractions or using outside resources to describe when students will start to just basically use Google Translate or they are just going to look in a dictionary and it's word for word. And it is really hard to control that when a student is sitting by themselves behind their computer and learning online virtually. And trying to encourage students to just use the materials that are provided to them. It partly starts with the prompts and the scenarios that we give them. So another, describe today's cars and how cars in the future will be different. If students aren't really interested in cars, or if they're not even driving yet, it's going to be kind of hard for them, and they're going to think that they need vocabulary that they don't have. And when we offer or when we present scenarios and prompts like this, we're kind of asking for it. I went through we keep a track of the infractions that we have with our learning community, and I went back and looked at that list, and then I looked at the list where more students were using outside resources, and then I compared it to the prompts, and I noticed that yes, they were a lot of personal ones. So again, students really want to tell you everything about, especially if they're feeling isolated in their home. They're wanting to tell you everything about themselves and their families and their friends, and they don't always have the vocabulary for it. So we run the risk when we write very personal or ask students to speak about their personal lives, of them wanting to go out and look for outside resources to tell you exactly what's going on with them. Also, in your own words, describe a recipe you found online. This is another prompt that we've used. And, there really is only certain ways to talk about how to make a macaroni and cheese or bake a cake or something. I mean, there's just, only certain words and so many ways you can say it. So again, these are some prompts that I do recognize that, students are more prone to use outside resources. So what are some prompts that you've used that you found successful and that students were engaged in, and in that they actually seem to encompass different levels? I know that I used a prompt one time and it just was so successful, and I could use it from kindergarten all the way up through high school. And it was first presented to me at an ACTFL conference in Nashville many years ago, and ACTFL is going to be in Nashville next year. There was like a speed kind of acting out model where a student sat down in one chair and another student and the chair was a girl and a boy, and they had to think of an excuse of not going out with the other. So I changed it and I said, your language teacher has just showed up at a party. And this happens, you show up at a party or you show up someplace, and they think automatically, oh no, I have to speak Spanish or French or Chinese to my teacher. And they had to think of excuses on why not to talk to me, but to be polite. So again, they could say, give me one word responses, or they could give me full sentences. And they were so excited. I had students just, diving in, trying to tell me their excuse, and excited to tell me an excuse on why they couldn't talk to me. So I would love to hear from you some of the prompts and scenarios that you have used that you have just found students to really get more engaged and get excited about talking.
It looks like there's some action in the chat window, but in this moment, I'll jump in. This is Stephen talking from Hawaii, and I will say that in an asynchronous teaching environment, I like task prompts that require a student to listen or read to what the student just before them has said, and then use that to answer. Like maybe the student before them poses a question that they have to answer, and then the student also has to leave something for the next student. So often in a chat, an asynchronous chat, a student would begin by answering the student before them, and then they would end by asking a question for the next student.
And those are great for role models as well. You know, when they see what another student wrote, they can sometimes use that same language chunk and recycle it. And the more they see it recycled and the more often they see it, you know, that's really going to stick with them.
It looks like in the chat, people are still talking about accessibility and universal design. But folks, we would like to hear from you about successful task prompts or scenarios.
I think somebody might CI, is that comprehensible input? Is that what we're just, yes. So what kind of prompts or scenarios that you have found students that were excited to talk about? So even in the asynchronous environment, I noticed that students, you know, they do like to talk about animals. Yet animals are universal. Animals and music. Yes, music is something that's very universal. Traditions and different cultural expressions. Yes, food. Mm-hmm. There we go. Lots for music. Great. Great, there's some great ideas. So now I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to step it up a little bit. There was an example of something called the raft strategy. Is anybody familiar with the raft strategy?
I've never heard of it.
The raft strategy, it's all about choices when we talk about differentiated instruction. And the raft assignment allows for learners to choose their assessment and respond to prompts that encourage them to think about different perspectives. So when we talk about intercultural communication or interculturality, I think that this is a very good strategy that would encourage or at least support that, you know, looking at different perspectives and also, you know, it also incorporates the idea of considering different career paths for learning another language or where we might use a language. No matter how many times I tell my students, you're going to use the language more here in the United States than you're going to use it studying abroad or when you go on out of the country. And so I would keep reiterating that. And then when I would survey them and I would say, you know, okay, so, you know, why do you think learning a language is important? They would always say, when I study abroad. So I really would like to encourage more of students to consider how they might use the language, you know, in their community or in the United States. I know that Louisville had a large refugee and immigration population, and so I would try to bring in people, you know, and just give and provide them with opportunities to get out into the community and notice that their language could be valuable in their very own community. So the raft strategy provides some choices. So the table shows in the first column, you're the role of the writer. So you kind of choose one from each. The role of the writer, who are you as the writer? So if this is a writing assignment, a presentational writing assignment, you're either going to be, let's say, a writer or a reporter or a character, an artist, a doctor, a salesperson. In the audience, who are you writing for? you're writing for yourself, maybe like a journal. Are you writing for peers, a teacher, a client, a parent, a government? So you can really see the range that you can go with this, you know, from novice to superior if you're talking about government and things like that and opinions. And then the format, you know, then they choose the format. Are you going to be writing a journal? Maybe an interview? Preparing for an interview? Are you going to create a cartoon? I had students create cartoons from very early on. It's a great way to incorporate that visual aspect. Sometimes if, you know, they can't express themselves, they can draw it and kind of explain it from there. Is it a critique, a video, a brochure? And then the topic, what are you writing about? Are you writing about a current issue, personal interest, a concern for the audience, whoever the audience is, or is it just informational? And I have a couple of examples. So here's an example, and this was adapted from an article that Toni Tyson wrote, and she just gave a she did a great job in covering differentiated instruction and providing examples on how you can use this in the classroom. And then I'm going to go back to the slide in just a second to talk about badges. So again, here's a very more specific example. Student would like to study abroad. Okay, you know, this is something that your high school and your college students, you know, they might be applying to study abroad. So they might write, the audience might be an organization, the format might be an application, and the topic is the reason for wanting to study abroad. Now, I know that Flipkey and Airbnb and, you know, homeowners and things like that are starting to jump on this real estate bandwagon. So you might consider an assignment where they are, and again, this is a choice. Let's say this right here was their assignment. They could either, you know, choose the role. Sometimes students feel anxious or uncomfortable creating their own scenario, so they would like to have a scenario that's already provided for them. But then there are others that would like their choice. So after students use the scenarios that are provided, it would be nice to see them venture out and create their own scenarios and their own formats using this example or using this format. So again, there's the real estate agent, a potential client. They could be creating a brochure or an advertisement, and the topic is to promote or it's informational. A guest who stayed at a host's home. So you're wanting to write a thank you letter to your host. And the topic is going to be that you're grateful for their generosity and kindness. And so you can see how this format can go in so many different directions and can really include so many different ranges of proficiency levels. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to step it up even more. So we've gone from scenarios to students creating their own scenarios to kind of incorporating that interculturality and looking at other perspectives, taking it up a notch, to badges. Now I know there's already programs out there that are digital badges, but I'm just going to take the badges down a notch to just that creative aspect of students and letting them own their learning and being more involved in their learning. So a badge is a distinguishing mark or emblem or sign of achievement. So this idea came to me with my I can statements. You know, I started creating these lessons in these units where I'd have one overarching question, and it would be, you know, I can plan and socialize in a party. And so everything we did in that unit was all about, you know, how to ask questions to students, how to, our peers, how to have those interpersonal conversations, how to write out an invitation and plan it. And, you know, so we had all these different, all this different information in that period that we brought together that covered presentational modes, interpersonal, and so forth. Now, what if we created a badge? Or what if a student had a certain interest and it wouldn't be so so off the wall that they actually went into a career path that included their personal interest and the language of the language that they were learning. So this idea is that the learners design a badge based on their interests. They set the goals. They design the assessment based on their proficiency level. And again, the assessment could be using that this raft format. And then hopefully that your students are starting to get as familiar as you are with the proficiency levels. And then they start to own their learning and include different modes of communication. So how fun would it be if a student could create their own badge, create their own assessment, and include the different presentational modes, and then present that to you once they're through. Again, differentiated instruction is all about going back to that UDL, providing multiple means of representation so they can get this information from different areas, using different modes and different resources, and providing multiple means of expressing what they know and expressing what they've learned. And oops, let me get back to here. So again, here is an example with the badge. So we have a globe. Let's say the student designed a globe as a badge. They created their assessment by saying, okay, I'm going to create an application or a personal letter stating why I want to study abroad in the target language, and the audience is this and so forth. Again, here, and then you have at the bottom a choice. So again, that gives the student the freedom to create something and understand those proficiency levels and demonstrate their learning in a way that they feel most comfortable. So considering the definition of the universal design for learning and the strategies we just discussed, I want to just take a couple minutes to see if we could come up with a badge or a scenario or both that would encourage learners at different proficiency levels.
This is Stephen. I'm jumping in because Michelle has given us a challenge, and that is for us to particularly consider younger children, early learners, because they might not have the sophistication to be able to handle that, the organizational, the rubric that you just showed to organize their own learning in that way. Anyway, Michelle says, can we have some scenarios or task prompts that are more specific to younger students that differentiate?
Yes, I actually, like I said, I was in elementary school prior, so I had, most of my units were, and I can't leave from here. One was talking about I can interact with my community and in the classroom. And so we had I was able to get a map of our school. And so let's say you could create the badges. You could have the students design their badge, but give them some structure. Let's say you gave them a schoolhouse, and that was the badge. And then we had certain I can statements that we wanted to demonstrate. We want the students to demonstrate in order to earn that badge. And so there's different ways that you could do that. I used a system called Si Se Puede that I created, where we had language cafes where students could kind of talk, and in the virtual, and I transferred that to the virtual learning as well, where the students could just jump in, and as they demonstrated, I would just check off that they could do that. So, if they have those I can statements, a list of 2, 3, 4 I can statements, and once they've been able to demonstrate those in a variety of ways. I mean, if a student just answered a prompt from me, I would check it off. And then they would earn that badge. And when I walked into the classroom or when I work with students, I try to find ways that I know or I feel that they would be most successful in. So lots of scaffolding, lots of kind of structured activities that are going to encourage them to be successful, making them aware of that I can statement, making their learning coaches or the people around them of their learning, those learning I can statements. The I can statements were great with elementary levels. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I do have an elementary. I'm excited to hear that there's elementary. I wasn't sure if there was going to be elementary, so I didn't include a lot of elementary examples. But there is one example that I added towards the end of this that I can discuss a little bit more about how we scaffold students and how we encourage them feeling successful learning the language.
I'll jump in and say that just now what you said about the I can statements being used by the younger learners seems to suggest that you're still giving them a look from the outside at their own learning. In other words, you're giving them a meta-awareness that I'm going to learn, I'm going to plan for learning. So even if you phrase it all in a simple way, you're still doing that function, which is kind of in Bloom's taxonomy, that would be a sort of moving, a little bit higher. And I find that very interesting. So that you're not suggesting that we abandon that self-design, but that we somehow make it possible for the younger students to do that by
And
scaffolding them.
what I did in the virtual, when I went from the brick and mortar, and I had this great system with the I can statements, and they had little dots that they would color in when they would demonstrate it, and they were so excited about coloring in that little dot. So that when I started working on a language project, it was a language program for elementary school students. I sent out a document that they could print off. And as they accomplished those I can statements, they colored them in. And they were just as excited, and they were just as excited to share with me how they demonstrated that they could do that. So if it was, I can greet someone, that was, and a lot of them would start off with very simple tasks like that. And then it was, I can tell you how old I am. And then they would show that. And then it was also something that engaged not just the younger students, but the adults around them. And when the adults saw that the student was excited to share, because when you give them those I can statements, you're giving them this kind of platform to share with you what they're learning. And so the students were demonstrating that they were excited to share with their parents, and then they started teaching their parents. And so, this started this kind of domino effect, and then the parents started to get involved and excited about learning the language, where, it's something that, oh, that's what they're doing, that's not for me, I'm too old. Whereas the I can statements and that sharing environment and that excitement about learning and checking off that they could do something in the language really encouraged more and more participation. I'm sorry, I'm just checking out the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Nadine. Can I jump in here?
Yeah. Please.
Susan, can you talk a little bit about what you do with the badges? Once they've earned these badges, does that become somehow a part of their assessment? Are they visually represented somewhere in the online environment? Do students have a way to sort of show off what badges they've earned? Or can you talk a little bit about what you or the students themselves do with those badges once they've earned them?
Well, what I've noticed, especially in the elementary school environment, and I basically use that more so with them, is that it was just something, like I said, that for them that was tangible, that they could share with adults. And what happens when students share that badge, and again, I love the definition of badge that we talked about, that I mentioned earlier, a distinguishing mark or emblem or sign of achievement. When they actually would share that with an adult, the adult most of the time is going to show or reflect that excitement back to them. So that's their motivation. That's what encourages them to keep coming back for more. And so it's not, necessarily something that they would collect, or, some students would just kind of throw them off to the side. I did it and that was over. When I was in a brick and mortar school, students would come up to me out of the blue and be like, "Oh, I've got so many, we didn't have badges. They were called si se puedes. They were dots. It was yes, I can." And every time a student would accomplish something, I would say si se puede, and I would tell them a color. So for them, it was just a color. But again, it was more about them sharing their learning, and then the adults around them kind of reciprocating that excitement and enthusiasm for learning back to them. And that's really what it was all about. I had 600 students. And then in the virtual, you can't give them, toys, trinkets, candy, like they often do in the brick and mortar environment, in order to get them to do things. So again, it's just that pride in learning something. And I think that's what the badge, that's what I think is adaptable for even middle and high school students, for them to design their badge that shows a little bit more ownership and excitement, to demonstrate either a personal interest or something that they're wanting to learn. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it
Great.
did. Thank you. Should we we don't have too much more time. Do you want to work on this activity for just a second, or just look at a few questions from the chat?
Yeah, I just have like 2 more slides, and I just love that somebody used the idea of a stamp. We also created something like that in Jefferson County Public Schools for the middle. Somebody had seen my dots that we would color in, and then they adapted it for middle and high school. And kind of like a tic-tac-toe, you could demonstrate certain I can statements and color them in as you accomplish them, and then share that with your teacher. I was going to ask about what careers can be incorporated into badging, what personal interests, and how can we encourage different perspectives. And I think that raft assignment is very promising in kind of bringing in that interculturality and bringing in that idea that there are other perspectives. Again, I'm not going to go into that, but it's something that I'd like to kind of leave you with thinking about, and trying to encourage your students to think about using the language, not just to study abroad, but how could they use it in their community, or in how other ways. The elementary example, I know there might be a few elementary people out there. We did in some of our activities at Middlebury, we would ask students, and we use Blackboard Collaborate, to go into breakout rooms and have these conversations. However, we didn't always have a kind of step for students who weren't there yet. So what I made sure we had in each of these activities is, you kind of first test the water, see if they can have that conversation, provide them with some visuals that they can use to kind of springboard off of. But if they aren't there yet, just reading the prompt with you and working on that pronunciation and working on feeling confident in speaking in the language. So, just kind of reading back and forth with the students. If I was to read part A, they would read part B. Again, having the animals there and so forth, as a way to encourage them. We're not always testing them. We always want to encourage them to learn and to use a language. And the last part is the feedback sandwich. We've talked a lot about how we get them to talk, but once they've done it, we want to keep them talking. So the last thing I want to talk about is the feedback sandwich. You start with something positive, you say something encouraging or constructive. That's where your feedback and giving them some notes on how to do something differently, and then positive and pointing out towards resources. So, you might say, great job, you incorporated the vocabulary from the unit. I always say that because I want them to use the materials that we're providing, not outside resources. And I constantly kind of, nod to that. And then, I noticed they didn't use the gender agreement, so I might mention that. And then end with, hey, you can also review this lesson. And if you have any questions, come to me. Please ask me. Students are so reluctant to ask you questions. In Spanish, there's another format that I've used, which is bien dicho, well said, you said this great. Here's something you said, but you could say it a little bit different, mejor dicho. And then para practicar is here's something that you can practice. So again, trying to keep it positive and simple. You don't have to point out every single error, just a couple. And then we're at the end, and I just wanted to make sure that you were familiar with the equity and accessibility and consider adjustments to your lessons and materials so you don't have to go back and change them as these legislation and things like that starts to expect us to requires more and more from us to make sure that our materials are accessible. The proficiency levels. If you hadn't heard of Universal Design for Learning, I think it's a great little foundation. Strategies to incorporate different levels, and always brainstorming and using your personal learning communities to kind of bounce scenarios and prompts and ideas off each other.